Welcome. I'm Douglas Stewart McDaniel, your host, and this is the very first actual premiere of the Premium Pulp Fiction podcast. How much more alliterative could that be? Welcome to the premiere episode of the Premium Pulp Fiction podcast, my creative lab and occasional crime scene where we break apart the craft, chaos, and world building behind every story I write. If you wandered in from Citizen One, it's good to see you. Over there, we dissect the future of cities. Here's where those ideas mutate into narrative worlds, past, present, and whatever future I'm brave enough to invent. Here we talk character arcs, narrative engines, AI tools, and this strange alchemy that turns curiosity into fiction. This is where truth gets its hands dirty and the worlds we build still smell like the soil that birthed them. I'm Douglas Stewart McDaniel, and today, for this premiere episode, we're going back to the very first spark of the Ashes of Empire saga, back before chapter outlines, research, character sheets, before GIS map data took over my weekends like an unpaid second job. Today, we're going back to the desert, not metaphorically, I mean the desert. Wadi Rum, Petra, Hegra, and Aulula, the red stone cathedrals of time. This is the origin story of Ghost Emperor. And if you're a writer, this is also a masterclass in how sparks become story worlds. I didn't go to Jordan looking for a book. I went there the way a lot of us go anywhere after losing patience with our own lives, just to get the hell out of town for a while. I ended up wandering through the scorched sandstone canyons of Wadi Rum, where the silence feels older than empires and the shadows move like they're thinking about something. It's a landscape that has already played half of Hollywood: Star Wars Rogue One, Dune, Lawrence of Arabia. But what hit me wasn't any of those. It was the feeling that the ground itself had memory, that the desert wasn't empty. It was editing. And then Petra cracked me open. Not the postcard Petra, the filtered Instagram Petra. I mean the carved silence of it, the side canyons, the cave metropolis that isn't on all the tourist maps, the chill inside those tombs. That sense that entire worlds rose and fell while these stones just waited. Then Hegra in Saudi Arabia, where the Nabateans built their own city of the dead, sun-baked tomb facades that look like stone lungs breathing heat. And somewhere between Sila and Meydan Saleh, the spark landed. Now, before we go any further into deserts and maps and the slow-motion implosion of an empire, I need to tell you something that I didn't put in the author's note. Not because it wasn't important, but because I still don't know where I first heard it, and that is the most wonderful of oral traditions, I think. Can't remember the book, the professor, the lecture, the footnote, the documentary, the conversation. I just remember the impact, that gut punch moment when the past suddenly widens into something far more violent, far more complex, and far more human than the sanitized versions we were fed in those now debunked Western civilization courses. It was the story of Antigonus Monophthalmus and his son Demetrius, two of Alexander's most ruthless successors, Greek generals who, only a few years after Alexander's death, set their sights on the Arabian shield of the Hejaz Mountains. They launched 3 successive campaigns into Nabatean territory, driven by strategic arrogance and the fantasy that nothing in the desert could resist them. On the first attack, the Greeks stormed Sila, sacked Nabatean settlements, and stole 12 tons of silver. 12 tons! Along with women and children taken as slaves. The kind of detail that should live in the center of any history class about empire, but somehow doesn't. The Nabateans, of course, did what empire never expects from the people it imagines as footnotes at the margins of society. They fought back. not with phalanxes, not with cavalry the way the Greeks understood it, but with something that shouldn't have existed in the Greek imagination at all: an 8,000 member camel cavalry. 8,000 on camelback, with terrain mastery, supply chain genius, and a tactical imagination the Greeks never saw coming. They crushed Antigonus's forces in the rock cut passes near Sela. Then they fought the Greeks again and again. 3 battles, 2 decisive Nabatean victories, and 1 grudging stalemate that still reads like a warning. And yet, outside of a handful of scholars, who knows this? Who teaches it? Where does it appear in the grand heroic arc of Western civilization? It doesn't, because the Greeks buried it, and the Nabateans never wrote it down or carved it into stone. It was folded into the category of historical embarrassments that empires quietly redact, a suppression so successful that even most classicists skim past it on their way to the more glamorous bloodletting in Macedon, Egypt, or the plains of Ipsus. But this cluster of forgotten desert wars was the crack in the empire's armor, a glimpse of the world Alexander's successors inherited, fractured, contested, mythic, and soaked in dread. And it was the moment I realized nobody has ever told the real story of the succession wars of the Diadochi like it actually felt. Not the fan wiki version, not the Wikipedia bullet list, but the horror of it, the mythic dread, the political fracture so deep it felt religious. This was not history as chronology. This was history as omen. And once I understood that, once that knowledge lodged somewhere under my ribs, Ghost Emperor stopped being an idea and became an inevitability. That moment is exactly what I describe in my Wonder Dog private writing workshops as story sparks. A line, an image, a fact, a rumor that refuses to go away. Sparks that carry immediate stakes, voice, and world. Mine was simple. A forgotten battle, 8,000 Nabatean camel cavalry, a Greek column shattered in the rocks. A footnote with the energy of a prophecy. Part 2. In my writing classes, I tell students that sparks don't matter unless you interrogate them. Ask questions until the spark starts breathing. So I started interrogating mine. Who the hell were these Nabateans to humiliate a Macedonian war machine? Why is this story buried under centuries of sand while we glorify Alexander's every sneeze? What would happen if we treated this period not as dusty chronology, but as prestige television? What if the body of Alexander, the literal corpse, became the crown everyone is killing each other to possess? And once I touched that last question, the desert lit up like a fuse. That's the spark funnel in action, the exact method I outline in my writing classes. Notice, interrogate, pressure test, and then expand. Part 3. There's a reason Ghost Emperor sits between historical fiction, political horror, and myth-soaked prestige drama. Because the history itself already lives there. It doesn't need dragons or fiction to tell the truth. Alexander dies in Babylon, and nobody really knows why. Poison, fever, divine strike. The sources contradict each other. The diaries contradict the sources. The eyewitness accounts contradict themselves. Great. A novelist's playground. And in that chaos, I recognize something in myself. How grief reorganizes ambition. How uncertainty becomes its own kind of myth. But Ghost Emperor isn't fan fiction for classicists. This is a story about grief, weaponized into empire. About men who believe proximity to a body, a corpse, entitles them to rule the world. About a queen who kills another queen because the world has left her no other path to survive. About legitimacy, myth-making, ritual, betrayal in the first century of what would eventually become Western political theater. That's why the historical appendix exists in the back of my novel, because it's the boundary stone where fact dissolves into vision. Every major event has 1 foot in the record and 1 foot in the abyss. Part 4. If you followed me on Substack or Instagram, you've seen the map atlas, the KML layers, the bronze pins, the 17 rewrites of Thrace, the compass rose I obsessed over for days longer than necessary. None of that was ornamental. None of it was aesthetic filler. It was the direct result of years spent learning how to see landscapes, historical, archaeological, mythic, political, as systems, as story engines, as characters. That education didn't arrive from books alone. It came from the extraordinary privilege of working alongside people who have devoted their lives to decoding the desert. People like Dr. Samer Saleh at King Saud University in Riyadh. Dr. Saleh is one of those rare archaeologists who treats the Arabian Peninsula not as an academic abstraction, but as a living archive. His work on the caravan networks, the incense routes, Nabatean rock-cut inscriptions, and the defensive geometries of ancient desert fortifications helped me understand the Arabian Shield as a strategic world that the Greeks never quite grasped. With Dr. Saleh, I learned how deserts record everything: trade, drought, invasion, ritual, burial, and refusal. He taught me that the Hijaz is not empty. It's well annotated. I also had the great fortune to walk ancient Nabatean, Greek, and even Neolithic sites in Saudi Arabia with Dr. Guillaume Charlot, French archaeologist of Northern Arabian cultures from the CNRS. Dr. Charlot's work, meticulous, field-hardened, often conducted in heat so aggressive it rearranges your willpower, showed me how cultural worlds pile atop one another in the sand. Nabatean, Leonite, Dedanite, Roman, Byzantine, Keterite, every layer whispering through the next. From him, I learned that world building is an invention, it's excavation. What you don't show is as important as what you reveal. Silence is as much a narrative artifact as stone. And then there is my friend Alex McDowell, production designer, world builder, the man who built the future of Los Angeles in Minority Report, and then pioneered the entire discipline of structured world building with films like Fight Club, Man of Steel, Sweeney Todd, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I had the good fortune to work with Alex on speculative urban futures in the desert. As a storyteller, it was like having your brain rewired. He doesn't build stories, he builds story worlds, ecosystems with rules, cultures, physics, histories, economies, political currents, and mythic underpinnings. Then our stories grow inside that ecology, not on top of it. His world-building mandala became one of the core frameworks I used to understand the Hellenistic world, not as a chronology, but as a living ecology of power. Landscape as fate, infrastructure as ideology, culture as physics, myth as policy, and conflict as climate. Alex's method is deceptively simple. Build the world until it demands a story, and then listen to what it tells you. That changed everything for Ghost Emperor. It forced me to build the world not from plot, but from systems, the story ecologies of a place and time taken to its highest resolution, as I teach in my writing classes. Now, what does story world ecology mean for Ghost Emperor? Because, well, the world of Ghost Emperor had to feel political, every alliance a tectonic shift, cosmological, every omen a referendum on fate, cultural, Egyptians, Babylonians, Macedonians, Persians. An empire is not one voice. And then it's also geographic. Mountains as fortresses, deserts and passes as filters, rivers as arteries. The desert is not backdrop. Babylon is not ambience. Egypt is not merely scenery. The novel only started clicking when I realized the world itself had to function as a character, a witness, a judge, and a conspirator. Alexander may be dead, but the empire he left behind is very much alive, and the land remembers everything. He ruled that empire for 11 years, and yet it took 43 years, nearly 4 times as long, to settle the successor disputes and wars across 31 military campaigns. Part 5. Ancient historians are invaluable, but they are not neutral. They look backward across centuries and try to make sense of people who lived with their backs against the wall, people who didn't leave tidy lessons or coherent motives behind. They render chaos as narrative, contradiction as intention, myth as a kind of moral shorthand. And in doing so, they give us something useful, but not always the truth. Plutarch, especially, hovers over this novel like a kindly but mistaken uncle, affectionate toward his subjects, confident in his interpretations, certain he understands the temperament of men who would have terrified him in life. When he writes about the Diadochi, he writes from a later world that has already digested their violence into parable. He tries to civilize men who lived in a century when civilization itself was slipping its moorings. I admire him. I'm indebted to him, but he is no guide to the emotional topography of this area. He has already edited it. So the work of fiction becomes the work of restoration, not of factual accuracy. I'll leave that to the historians, and the footnotes handle that, but of emotional fidelity, of stepping into the silences where the ancient texts avert their gaze, where the chroniclers give us truth counts instead of terror, the outline of a betrayal instead of the dread that preceded it, the bare fact of an omen without the shiver running through the man who witnessed it. To write this story, I had to imagine what the historians did not or could not, the world behind the world, the private conversations that never made it to parchment, the rituals performed behind a stretched curtain of incense and fear, the ways in which a wet nurse, a priestess, a servant, a child, people who lived beyond the historian's lamp might have shaped the destinies of kings simply by surviving beside them. Characters like Thais of Ecbatana grew from that shadow world, a priestess turned wet nurse whose presence inflects history with prophecy. The camp followers, the soldiers' wives, the children being dragged into the machinery of empire, all of them carry the story in ways the generals never could. They see what the powerful deny, and they absorb the cost. Even the omens, the verses, the early threads of what the novel calls the scroll war came from this need to fill the spiritual and metaphysical space that the historians flatten into anecdote. A world this fractured would not have interpreted events literally. It would have read meaning into every bird flight, every liver mark, every dream that crawled out of fever. To ignore that worldview would have been to misrepresent the century entirely. So the creative liberties are not mere embellishments. They are acts of reconstruction. Plutarch left us shapes, outlines, impressions. I tried to crawl inside those shapes and find the pulse. To imagine the sweat on the back of the man lifting Alexander's bier, the priestess who lies to a general and feels the weight of it settle into his bones, the child who senses the empire crumbling long before the men sworn to defend it will admit anything is wrong. History gives us the scaffolding. The silence gives us the humanity. And the novel lives where those two spaces meet, where history ends and mythiopia begins. Part 6. Why this story and why now? Well, because Ghost Emperor is a novel about the first great power vacuum of Western civilization, but it's also about all the ones we're living through now. We're watching empires fray, institutions rot, myths collapse, information fragment, and bodies become symbols instead of people. Sound familiar? Prestige historical fiction only matters when it helps us understand the present. When I stood in Wadi Rum the first time, watching the sun set behind those impossible red cliffs, I didn't know I had just stepped into a decade-long project. I didn't know an empire was whispering to me. I didn't know a footnote was about to become a universe. But that's the thing about sparks. They don't arrive fully formed. They arrive as questions, as invitations. Your job as a writer isn't to wait for the muse. Your job is to notice the spark, interrogate it, and build a world that can hold the weight. That's what Ghost Emperor is, a world that could hold the spark. Thank you for joining me for this first premiere episode of the Premium Pulp Fiction podcast. I'm Douglas Stewart McDaniel, your host and author of the new novel, Ghost Emperor. My next episode is going to be in a completely different direction. It's called AI Clones and the Art of Creative Replication. And that's a whole different kind of myth and sorcery. I'm Douglas Stewart McDaniel. Welcome to the Saga.